Today is cutdown day, and the Pittsburgh Steelers and the rest of the NFL have a 4 p.m. Eastern Time deadline to get their roster down to 53 people. And today, the Pittsburgh Steelers have made a lot of cuts. Yesterday, the Pittsburgh Steelers have made a lot of cuts to their team as well, so let's go through it. But first, before I get more into it, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications for everything Pittsburgh Steelers news and updates. Also, like this video. Now, let's get right back into it. So, for the Pittsburgh Steelers, the first wave of cuts came yesterday, where they released a group of 8 players. And the 8 players were running back Dejon Edwards, wide receiver TJ Luther and Jacob Copeland, offensive lineman Tyler Beach and Devery Hamilton, defensive lineman Marquise Spencer, and linebacker Kavon Kazino, defensive back Keandre Thomas. That was the first group of players released by the Pittsburgh Steelers. But then later in the day, the Pittsburgh Steelers, they made 3 more cuts to their roster. And the 3 players that they cut were offensive tackle Anderson Hardy, cornerback Kyler McMichael, kicker Matthew Wright. And those players were all cut by the Pittsburgh Steelers on Monday. So that's a group of 11 players cut in one day. And that means the rest of the players that I'm going to name of being cut all happened today on cutdown day. And to start off, the first player who was cut today was outside linebacker Kyron Johnson. Some more players that were cut today were fullback Jack Calito, cornerback Thomas Grant Jr., wide receiver Quez Watkins. So, just to be clear, there are way more cuts to be made. Around 20 more players will be cut. But as of right now, 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time, these are the players that were cut. 15 players thus far. So, those are the players the Pittsburgh Steelers have cut so far to try to get their roster to 53. And just to kind of give a quick note on each guy that was released, here it is. Let's start with Edwards. He was an interesting undrafted free agent person out of Georgia. A good contact to balance runner with some special teams value, but playing time was hard to find during training camp, and he got half the carries of the next closest back on the depth chart. Despite a couple solid runs in the limited preseason action that he got, he had a little chance to make the 53-man roster because of it. And he'll account for $6,000 in dead money against the Steelers salary cap in 2024 and $12,000 in 2025. Looking at Luther, he was signed on the final day of training camp. I said in that video, he barely had any chance to make the team because of it. Not participating in training camp or getting signed late to training camp is going to hurt your chances. He did play in 2 final preseason games, but he didn't catch a pass in those preseason games, so he was unable to haul in the touchdown that Justin Fields missed, where many people thought Justin Fields overthrew it, but it was a bad kind of route by Luther. He did stop running, and he was eventually cut from this team. Looking at Beach, he worked 3rd team left guard throughout training camp, but impact was not there. He did not impact this team. And Hamilton, he primarily logged time as a 3rd team left tackle, along with a handful of snaps at right tackle. He struggled in extended reps against the Lions, allowing 2 sacks, one of which turned into a forced fumble and a turnover for the Steelers, and those 2 were eventually cut. Looking at Spencer, he was added during training camp to provide nose tackle depth. He logged 28 snaps over the past 2 games of the preseason, and he was cut. Looking at Tazino, the Pittsburgh Steelers are stacked at inside linebacker. They're not going to cut Patrick Queen. They're not going to cut Elena Roberts, Mark Robinson, more than likely, Medikevich. They're not going to cut Cole Holcomb. So they're really stacked at inside linebacker. And Tazino really had no chance. He was more of a depth person. Maybe he comes back in the practice squad, but he was eventually cut by this team as well. So you look at Thomas. He struggled against the Lions, giving up multiple second half receptions, and he allowed 3 completions on 4 targets for 48 yards. And this is the first group of 8 players that were released, and just a quick note on each guy. Out of this first group of players, the only person who might have been a shocker is Dejon Edwards. I did have him making my 53-man roster in my initial prediction. I only did one prediction, and I had him making it, but he was cut from this team. It's not surprising after all because he did not really do much, but he was the only one who could have been a surprise out of all the rest of the players. Now, moving over to the second group up wave of players that were cut, the 3 players the same day. Anderson Hardy, Kyler McMichael, Matthew Wright. Just a quick note on them. Hardy ran a third-team right tackle through a training camp. To his credit, he was healthy and available for each practice and all 3 preseason games, but undersized for the position. He kind of struggled in pass protection during practices and the preseason games, and he graded out as one of the NFL's worst offensive tackles in the training camp and preseason kind of in evaluations. So you look at McMichael, he was reported earlier in the day, and the team kind of kept him from Monday's practice, given the injuries to Joey Porter Jr. and Corey Trace Jr., who sat out this session, but he was signed away midway through camp. So he did not really have a true chance to make this team. When you sign during training camp, you don't get all the reps, and you have a less chance to make this team. McMichael, he logged a fair number of reps in kind of training camp in terms of playing in the preseason, but other than that, he really had no chance to make this 53-man roster, and he was cut. Looking at Wright, the Pittsburgh Steelers seem to always sign him, cut him, sign him, cut him, but he has an NFL resume, and he could find himself on another team over the next few weeks for teams that need a field goal kicker. In 24 career regular season games, he's made 85% of his field goals and 6 for 9 from 50 yards plus. So the Pittsburgh Steelers, he was never going to stick because Chris Boswell is still their kicker, but maybe he comes back to the practice squad, or maybe he doesn't, but the Pittsburgh Steelers seem to always sign him and cut him, and now he's released once again. So that does it. Those are the 11 players from the first day, and a quick note on all of them. Out of those 3 players, is there any surprises? No, there is not. To me personally, all 3 guys, they look like they were going to get cut just in terms of their production not being there. So that was everyone who was cut yesterday. Now the Steelers today made more cuts. Let's go through each player individually as well today. So like I said, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the first player they cut today was Kyron Johnston. And he was actually surprise cut. He was the first player cut today, and he was surprising because now he played really well in the season, in the preseason, and played well in training camp, and I really thought he had a good chance to make this team. It looks like the Pittsburgh Steelers are moving in a direction where DeMarvin Leal could play both outside linebacker edge rusher and inside defensive line. And it looks like that's probably where they're headed, so it means that's kind of the keynote to this cutting. Looking at Thomas Graham Jr., he was the one person that was going to be competing with Beanie Bishop Jr. for the slot cornerback position, and he was cut by this team, meaning Beanie Bishop more than likely will be making the final 53-man roster. Looking at fullback Jack Leto, he was cut. He really had no opportunity to make this team. If the Steelers wanted to keep a fullback and wanted to actually play a fullback, they more than likely would go Connor Hayward. They could even play Darnell Washington there, so he had no chance of making this final roster. Maybe a practice squad for both those guys, who knows. Wide receiver Quez Watkins, the Pittsburgh Steelers are slim at wide receiver. He looked like a lock to make this team at the beginning of training camp when he was first signed this offseason, but he had some bad plays on the football field, and he could not return punts. He kept dropping them, didn't know what he was doing on punt returns, and he was eventually cut from this team, and the Pittsburgh Steelers move on from him. Now, looking at some of the other players that were cut throughout the league that the Pittsburgh Steelers could have interest in, or just former Steelers players that were cut. First off, let me say Juju Smith-Schuster, he was signed by the Kansas City Chiefs yesterday, so really great having him back in the league. Well, looking at Martavis Bryant, he got his chance to return to the NFL, and he played in the training camp. He was in the preseason with the Washington Commanders, and he got cut by them after also being cut by the Cowboys earlier on in the offseason as well. You look at Miles Boykin, he was cut. Looking at Allen Robinson, he was cut by the New York Giants. Looking at James Pierre, he was cut as well. Presley Harvin was also cut by the 49ers. He obviously will not be returning. and Noah Brown was cut by the Texans. So those players are former Steelers, and some players the Pittsburgh Steelers may have interest in. Noah Brown, really good blocking, really huge wide receiver, and he could be someone the Pittsburgh Steelers look to bring in. You look at wide receivers, Miles Boykin. He could be another person the Pittsburgh Steelers look to bring in strictly because of his gunner skills on special teams, alongside James Pierre being a really good gunner as well. They lost both of them. Those were the two Pittsburgh Steelers gunners last season, and meaning that they have to move to different gunners on special teams this season. And so far in the preseason, no one really looked like they were doing too good. A lot of missed tackles. Darius Rush was getting time at gunner, but it seemed like he was missing every tackle and he didn't know what he was doing there. The Pittsburgh Steelers may choose to just move on from them entirely, go different route with gunners this season, or because now they were cut, maybe they decide to bring back some of their special teams players they had last season for this season. So those are guys to keep an eye on in terms of returning to the Pittsburgh Steelers. The other guys in terms of Allen Robinson, Martavis Bryant, those are just former Steelers who got released. I would not look at those players as coming back, and the Steelers really don't need them. So Miles Boykin, James Pierre, maybe Noah Brown could be a signing the Pittsburgh Steelers make in the future. But anyway, those are some of the releases around the NFL that the Steelers may have interest in. Now, with that being said, this is the end of the video. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below on all the releases, all the cuts the Pittsburgh Steelers have made to get their roster down to 53 thus far. Do you think the Pittsburgh Steelers, they released anyone that they're going to regret releasing? That's someone who may succeed in the NFL on a different team if they are picked up? Are there any surprise cuts to you? Or are these just regular cuts that you saw coming? And who are you most excited for who made the 53-man roster to play this upcoming season that you thought may not have made it? Let me know your thoughts. And also, once again, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for everything Pittsburgh Steelers news, updates, highlights, analysis, reports, and breaking news. I cover everything, and I'll continue to cover everything as we head into the regular season, just as I did the whole offseason. So, like, comment, subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you guys all later. Until next time, I'm out. Peace.